Hello friends, in the previous video we talked about the inverter and learned that if we want to start and stop the inverter using the keypad, what settings we need to make. Also, if we want to set the frequency on the inverter using the keypad, what settings we need to adjust on this inverter. In this session we want to keep the start and stop the same as before using the keypad, but this time we want to set the frequency using an analog voltage input from 0 to 10 volts like an analog potentiometer. We'll learn together what settings we need to make on this inverter. So just like we said in the previous session, if we want to start and stop the inverter from the keypad, that is, using the green and red buttons, the DR parameter should be set to 0. That's for start and stop. We said that we want to set our frequency using an analog voltage input from 0 to 10 volts, like an analog potentiometer. So what settings do we need to make on the inverter? As we mentioned a few moments ago, when we want to set the frequency from the keypad, the parameter for the frequency reference, which was FRQ in the main operation group, should be set to 0, and then the frequency is set via the keypad. Here, we want to use a potentiometer from 0 to 10 volts, a potentiometer from 0 to 10 volts to send the frequency to the inverter. What should we do? The FRQ parameter should be set to 2. That means our FRQ should be set to 2, and our 0 to 10 volt input should be connected to terminal V1. But how do we connect our 0 to 10 volt potentiometer to the inverter? What will our wiring look like if we have an analog potentiometer or the same? If we have a potentiometer that we want to connect to the analog inputs of the inverter, we need to connect the middle pin of the potentiometer to the V1 terminal and the other two pins to VR and CM. CM is our common terminal and VR is the voltage terminal which provides the 10 volt supply. The VR terminal has the 10 volt voltage, but if we want to use a 2-wire sensor, if we want to connect it, meaning if we have a sensor or a controller that has its own power supply and gives us an analog voltage output, and we want to connect that to our inverter, the two wires coming from our controller, which are the analog voltage output, should be connected to the analog voltage input of our inverter at the V1 and CM terminals. Now, for an analog input, we need to define 2 points for the inverter, the minimum point and the maximum point. We have to specify at the minimum voltage what the frequency should be, and at the maximum voltage what the maximum frequency should be. These parameters are INSF8, which sets the minimum voltage at the analog input, INSF9, which sets the minimum frequency at that point, INSF10, which sets the maximum analog input voltage, and INSF11, which sets the maximum analog input frequency. For example, if we set INSF08 to 0 volts and INSF09 to 0 Hz, at the 0 point our frequency will be 0 Hz, and if we set INSF 10 to 10 volts and INSF 11 to 50 Hz, at the 10 volt point our frequency will be 50 Hz. So for the analog inputs, we need to define 2 points for the inverter, the minimum voltage and minimum working frequency at the analog input, and the maximum voltage and maximum frequency at the analog voltage input. So up to this point, we've learned that if we want to control the frequency of this inverter 100 through the 0 to 10 volt analog voltage inputs, the FQ parameter should be set to 2, meaning 0 to 10 volts. The wiring will be such that if we want to connect a potentiometer or a volume knob to the inverter, the middle pin goes to V1, and the other two pins, one to CM, common, and the other to VR, voltage supply. And if we want to use a controller that gives us a 0 to 10 volt output and connect that to the analog input of the inverter, we should connect it to the V1 and CM terminals. We also learned that for the analog voltage inputs, we need to specify 2 points for the inverter, the minimum voltage and minimum frequency, and also set the maximum voltage and frequency for the inverter. Now let's go and set all these things together. We said that if we want to give the inverter a frequency through the 0 to 10 volt analog voltage input, and our frequency reference is the 0 to 10 volt analog voltage input, we need to set the FQ parameter in the main group to 2. Let's go to the FQ parameter, press enter to enter it. Right now it's set to 0, meaning the frequency is being set from the keypad. To set the frequency through the 0 to 10 volt analog voltage, we set it to 2 and press enter. We said that the start and stop, just like in the previous session and video, are from the inverter itself, meaning the green button is for running the inverter and the red button is for stopping it. For this, the DRD parameter should be set to 0, which it is, and we set it. Now, what will our wiring look like? If we want to connect our potentiometer to the inverter, the middle pin of our potentiometer, which is here, I connect the middle pin of our potentiometer to the V1 pin of this inverter. Okay, I connected the middle pin of my potentiometer to the V1 pin, and as for the other two pins, one of them goes to the common ground, to the black wire, and the other one goes to the power supply. I connected it to the V1 pin. So we connected our potentiometer to our device and connected it to the inverter. Now, if I turn the potentiometer on my panel, the frequency value on the inverter's keypad should change. Okay, now I'm turning the potentiometer. As you can clearly observe, the operational frequency value displayed on the inverter's keypad is actively changing. For a specific example, I will now manually set the frequency to 20 Hz, and you can see for yourself that the keypad on the inverter immediately reflects this change, also showing the number 20. Next, I will press the start button located directly on the inverter's control panel. You'll notice the inverter immediately starts up the connected water pump that is located right here, and the pump then begins to circulate the water inside this demonstration tank. Now, if I want to go ahead and increase the frequency value, once again, I simply turn up the control knob. As I do this, you can clearly see that the frequency value is being set and displayed right here on the inverter's keypad, and right now it has been set to a value of 46 Hz. Next, if I want to bring the system to a stop, all I need to do is press the prominent red stop button. When I do that, the inverter immediately stops its operation, and as a direct result, my pump completely turns off. If I start it again, my inverter will run at a frequency of 46 Hz. You can see that my tank starts filling up again, and if I want to lower the frequency again, you can see that it is set to number 2. So in this project, in this video, we learned that if we want to control the frequency of the inverter using a potentiometer with 0 to 10 volts or a 0 to 10 volt sensor, we need to set the FRQ parameter on this inverter to number 2.